All right. Hello and welcome to our Kentucky Commission on Women's Conversation with Commissioners. Welcome to our audience on YouTube and anyone else who might be watching this live stream. My name is Heather Deering, and I am the Deputy Chief of Staff to Lieutenant Governor Coleman and the Acting Director of the Kentucky Commission on Women. I'm so pleased to be here today for this sixth installment of our virtual Conversations with Commissioners series. The Kentucky Commission on Women was established in 1968 by Governor Louis Nunn by executive order, and then became an official state agency in 1970 through legislative action. After a period of dormancy, the commission was reactivated by Governor Beshear when he charged Lieutenant Governor Coleman with revitalizing it. Over the past several years, we've reestablished ourselves as the state agency whose mission is to strengthen, empower, and elevate women and girls in Kentucky. Our commissioners are an incredible and diverse group of women from all corners of the Commonwealth. So thank you to our commissioners who are joining this call today. When we launched our Conversations with Commissioners series, a live stream virtual conversation between commissioners and guests about a topic or theme that we feel is important to women in the Commonwealth, it was our intent to share these important conversations with everyone. We invite special guests who are knowledgeable or are experts in an area to present information, and when we have time, open it up to questions from our commissioners. Our theme, our guests, and our commissioner hosts changes every conversation. So this month, October, is nationally recognized as Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And last year, the Kentucky Commission on Women published a report called The Status of Kentucky Women. And in that report, we published data and statistics about all women in Kentucky. And one of those data points is that 45% of women in Kentucky will experience sexual or physical violence or stalking by an intimate partner within their lifetime. 45%. So if you do the math, and I don't do math out loud or on demand, but I did the math, that means of approximately 2.3 million women here in the Commonwealth, that totals to over 1 million women.
Yeah.
This conversation is, like I said, the sixth in our series of conversations with commissioners. Our previous topics have been about women in the workforce, Juneteenth, women's representation in the government, and women's health. And of these 6 conversations, aside from women's health, I don't know of a topic that is more relevant to women across Kentucky than this. It's not a topic we talk about often, and it's not a topic we should only be talking about in October, but it being Domestic Violence Awareness Month does make it an opportune time to do so. So I'm going to stop talking and let our experts do it. So before I hand it over to our host and guest of the day, I would like to note that the views expressed in today's presentation or in any materials shared are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Kentucky Commission or Women or the administration, and their presence does not constitute or imply an endorsement of their views. That being said, I would like to hand it over to our conversation host today, Commissioner Ann Perkins. Ann is a perfect host for today's conversation, as she is the Executive Director of Safe Harbor of Northeast Kentucky, a nonprofit that provides emergency shelter and advocacy for survivors of domestic violence. She's been there almost 30 years. Is that right, Ann?
I am. I was a board member for 10 years prior to being the director, so I have 37 years involvement with Safe Harbor.
Yes. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, we're honored to have you on the commission and grateful to have your leadership as an expert in this issue. So with that, Ann, I am going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Heather. I appreciate the opportunity that you've given to our state coalition and to our friends here today to be able to talk about this most important issue for women, especially, even though we actually serve all people, men, women, and children. But it is mostly affecting women in our state. And I want to talk a little bit, just give you a background about Safe Harbor. There are 15 programs in the state of Kentucky in every single ad district. And so Safe Harbor serves the 5 co-ad district, which is Boyd, Greenup, Carter, Lawrence, and Elliott. We've been here since 1983 in the old TB hospital. And we have taken over that complex one building at a time. We started out with emergency shelter, and we have renovated our building, and we actually have a 60-bed emergency program that is full every single day. And from there, we went on to understand that we needed a transitional program that allowed women who had very serious barriers to be able to have an opportunity to stay longer and to work through those barriers so that they could move into permanent supportive apartments. And then about 15 years ago, we took over the old TB hospital complex and did a $4.5 million tax credit project. And we created 34 one, two, and 3 bedroom apartments at Safe Harbor. So we pretty much have had a complete continuum of care for victims in the 5 Coad district for over 15 years, just through those 3 series of housing proponents. You know, a lot of people don't really care for what they consider emergency shelter, but so many, and I tell this story all the time, so many of our families have been ripped apart through foster care being the #1 reason for removal of children from the home for years was domestic violence. And by doing that, we have 4 generations of families who have been totally ripped apart, and there is no support system for those families. So when they walk into our doors here, it's pretty much, for many of those women, a first time for them to create what I would call a family situation where we have wrapped ourselves around that complete family and provided all the services that they need to get back on their feet. For those of us who are lucky to have family and support systems, that's where we have stepped in. And that's how I think, you know, as much as we don't like congregate shelter, it has for many people created that family atmosphere and support system that they've never experienced before, you know. And so I am just pleased and proud that we've been able to do that over the years. We've had support. We are in the KARs and KRSs of Kentucky now. So we're a mandated program, but a lot of times, you know, there's a lot of funded mandates out there. But I can say that recently, especially, our legislatures have been so supportive of us as we've tried to grow our program and work against what I would consider some of the biggest issues for Kentuckians is domestic violence, because it reaches across every socioeconomic factor in our lives. So, and I'm so happy today that I've got 2 just great friends, longtime friends. We have actually Judge Peggy Patterson, who is retired first woman federal magistrate in Kentucky, who actually was probably the instigator of promoting and establishing Safe Harbor in Ashland, Kentucky, through her work and efforts. And she's going to talk a little bit about that with you all. And the other person I have is a longtime friend, 27 years long, is Darlene Thomas, who has probably 30 plus years in the field. She's going to talk a little bit about her
36, yeah.
36, about as long as me. And she's going to talk about her evolution in the work here in Kentucky and the contributions that our state coalition has made, along with her program, which is GreenHouse17, which is the Bluegrass Ad District. So if we can get started, I'm going to just kind of pose some questions that are going to let them get started. I'm going to let Peggy start and give her kind of history of her involvement and how she helped what I consider be a groundbreaker in our services in the state of Kentucky.
Thank you, Ann. It's my pleasure to go back to the old days. And I'm very heartened when I think about that to see what has happened since, and especially, Ann, how you have built up Safe Harbor from a little tiny 3-bedroom house in Ashland to the extraordinary operation it is today. And I give you the lion's share of the credit for that. As far as my work with domestic violence, it began in 1976 when I came to Ashland, fresh out of law school, went to work as a law clerk for the federal judge there, David Hermansdorfer. I was the only lawyer in town, so I started getting calls from victims saying, "What can I do?" And I gave them the advice, well, if you want to prosecute, go to the prosecutor, or you can do this or that. And the answers I got back from was, I've tried that, it doesn't work. And Meanwhile, I need to get away. I need to get my children. We need to go somewhere safe. So I started talking first to my judge, and it turned out that his wife, Sally Hermansdorfer, was on the board of the National YWCA. And she told me that they had made a national priority of doing something about domestic violence. And in fact, we're working on starting shelters in Kentucky. So she put me in touch with the women first in Louisville and then in Lexington who were trying to start some shelters. The Louisville shelter opened in 1977, a year after I got involved, and then 1979, the Lexington shelter opened, both under the auspices of the YWCA organization. And my goodness, the help that they gave us about trying to get something started. We worked together on legislation. For example, one of the questions was, how do we get funding for our shelters? And somebody somewhere had the brilliant idea that one source of funding was to add a $5 fee to the marriage license, and we called it the user tax. And I helped draft the legislation and to get it passed. So every time you got a marriage license, you had to pay $5 that went toward funding shelters. That later came to be called trust and agency money. And I think it's up to about 23 million that has been collected since then as a result of just that one initiative. Another significant event in the early days was in 1978 when a woman from Ashland, Kentucky, Helen Hughes, became the executive director of the Kentucky Commission on Women. She was an Ashland native, and by the time she was appointed, I had gone to work in Ashland as a lawyer for David Welch, who Berea graduate, Harvard Law School, who was the chair of the Kentucky Human Rights Commission. And when Helen came by to say hi to him one day, he said, "You've got to meet this woman." My goodness, Helen was a dynamo and got things going. For example, in 1979, she commissioned a survey by the Lou Harris Polling Organization to gather data about the incidence of domestic violence in Kentucky. And the Lou Harris survey, as we called it, found that 1 in every 10 women married or living with a male partner had experienced some degree of spousal violence by their partner within the 12 months preceding the survey. The poll also indicated that 70,000 women had been victims of severe violence at some time in their lives. This is Kentucky women. This was one of the first pieces of domestic violence research conducted in the United States. So, armed with that powerful information, when we went to the legislature trying to get money, trying to get legislation passed, to do something to not only create shelters, but create some meaningful laws so women could get some relief, the commission was right there with us, helping us to make contacts with legislators, helping us, coaching us on how to lobby, and all kinds of serious behind the scenes but impactful work as far as dealing with domestic violence. Meanwhile, in Ashland, once the trust and agency money started going, I helped to put together a board of people. And by that time, I think by that time, Ann, you had become the executive director of the Ashland YWCA.
In
And
1986.
okay.
Yeah.
And but before then, I think you had been on the board anyway. But the Y was still pitching and hitting.
Mhm.
And by 1983, we scrounged together a little house, and the civic clubs came and decorated the rooms or provided bedding or whatever. Hope Lipsey was the first executive director, and we got going on this little bare bones operation. And then after that, we moved to a larger facility, the nurses' quarters, and I think that was 8 bedrooms, and got going trying to beef up the operations. And I think it was in 1996, Anne, that you became the executive director.
Actually, it was 98.
98.
Because I had rolled off the board for 2 years because I had served 2 terms. And so, and by then I had left the YWCA and I came back on as a board member in 98. And that's when I took over as the executive director.
Excellent. Well, one of the things that was bittersweet for me was that in 1990, I was appointed to the federal bench. So I had to sever all ties with the shelter. And that was hard to do because that was my baby. But then to watch it grow and expand under Ann has just made my heart soar. The one exciting thing, though, was I think it was 1994, Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act, a federal law that regulated domestic violence only if there was some sort of interstate transportation element involved. And I was very proud and pleased that one of the first prosecutions of that was brought before me as a judge. And what was especially interesting about that case, and this is all public record, so I'm not telling anything out of school, the defendant was Sonny Lanham, who some people may remember was in the Predator and 48 Hours movie. In Predator, he was the Indian guide with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and a big, scary looking dude. And the recommendations I got whether to put him in jail or not before he was tried, they said, lock this guy away. He is dangerous as heck. And so I locked him up and threats were made. And it was kind of a scary sort of thing, but he was convicted and the federal law held in. Of course, that doesn't apply that much because only interstate transportation is involved. But still, it was kind of my last gasp as far as being involved with domestic violence and trying to do what I could as far as the effort goes. But as I said, two organizations so impactful in this were the YWCA and the Kentucky Commission on Women, which I'm sure continues their efforts and is much appreciated.
Thank you, Peggy. I did want you to say that you thought that he was running, Lanham turned around after he got out of prison and ran for governor of the state of Kentucky. So
And
we
then
would have had a convicted felon running
And then
running for governor.
And then he
who,
ran for the U.S. Senate.
who was
And-
a sexual assault predator. The irony is crazy there. Yeah.
A precedent was set.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to ask Darlene to give us a little overview of your history and how you got started and talk a little bit about your program.
Well, first, I really want to say that the Kentucky Commission on Women was so critical in the beginning. And so I really stand on the shoulders of women like Peggy and the women of the commission and some female legislators back in the day and people who started the first shelters. I kind of stand on their shoulders. So I always want to honor this history that I'm going to tell you about. I can only speak from the language that I understand and know of my experiences, but how that's kind of impacted across the state is what I'd like to say, but it has to start somewhere, right? This movement had to start somewhere, and Kentucky started really early with the shelter services just 4 years after the first shelter in the nation. So we were kind of cutting edge, but in my career, like starting in the 1990s, I actually started in 1989 at Oasis in Owensboro, Kentucky. They hired me fresh out of college. And a friend of mine had said, hey, they're hiring at the Spouse Abuse Center. And I go, what the world's a Spouse Abuse Center? I never even knew what such a thing was, right? So even though programs had been about 10 years old, for sure in the state, it hadn't really caught on community-based, community-wide yet exactly what these programs are. And I think the impact that you're going to see over the next 30 years that we've had. I always remember that my starting salary there was $11,000 a year with a 4-year degree. That is so central to everything we do because we still to this day are trying to get our staff at living wages across the state. So it comes full circle for me. But in the 1990s, when I was brand new and a baby in this work, to having to harm hit the papers out of the Herald Leader. And it truly kind of it was groundbreaking. They won a Pulitzer Prize for it. And it kind of opened the door to systemic change. And before that time, my world was around shelters. I worked in shelters, second shift, third shift. Was so happy when I finally got the first shift shelter work and earned my keep, you might say, in this work. But to have to harm opened the doors with the work. And we began to throughout the 90s. I think from then on, for the next 10 years, we were on fire in the state. We were critical. We were the first in so many things, but we expanded the definitions of protective orders to include child support and custody, where before they weren't breaking, they were providing safety, but they weren't providing needs to maintain safety and for survivors to be able to stay away from their abusive partners. So we got those kinds of expansions. I was fortunate when I was at Oasis, I did a year-long study with Neil Webstale. So I implemented his tool that to this day has kind of been a standard bearer of what rural battering looks like in the justice system. That began to change laws throughout the state and make sure that we were including rural survivors, not just larger urban communities, and what those look like and what had to change as far as policing and the judicial system. We had, unfortunately, about that same time, Mary Byron was murdered by her intimate partner or former boyfriend, and her mother, Pat Byron, who is an incredible human being, and husband John then began this crusade in honor of their daughter whose life was taken to start VINE, which is victim information notification every day, which was a critical service to survivors to know when their batterers were being released from the jail system so that they had some access of knowledge to find safety or get to safe places at that time for themselves. Today, that VINE system is used in 47 of 50 states. So Kentucky's impact has just been huge. In 93, what do we have? VAWA. The VAWA Act was passed by Joe Biden that Peggy mentioned. But one of the things, other than interstate enforcement of protective orders, which is really cool, Kentucky's role in that as well. But it also began to require partnerships between legal advocates, prosecutors, and DV programs if you were going to get federal financial support. I will say that VAWA is 30 years old. And I just have to say, last year I was invited to attend the 30th anniversary in DC, and I got to meet President Joe Biden at that time. And I gave him a fist bump and thanked him for all of his work on behalf of domestic violence survivors and across the country. With that, though, with the VAWA Act, Janet Reno kind of picked Kentucky to do the interstate enforcement. And at that time, it was called Full Faith and Credit, right? And out of Full Faith and Credit, this idea of Project Passport was born. In Kentucky, Zero V, currently Zero V, back then was called KDVA, right? They were the ones that put it together. We were selected as a state to create the enforcement, the interstate enforcement, because we had so many border states. Once we were selected, then what happened is all of the protective orders across the nation look just like Kentucky's. So I just want people to know that Kentucky really has led the way. We then created victim service standards so that every shelter in the state kind of had a standard by which any survivor, no matter what domestic violence program you go to, will have a basic set of core services that you could expect no matter where you are, which is really critical of bringing all of our programs together, getting us all on the same page. Even though we're all unique in how we do things, you look at Ann, she's so strong in housing because there's not a lot of housing there. If you go to Northern Kentucky, they are so strong in prevention. Not that they don't do amazing other pieces, but they're so strong in prevention work that they do in their communities. Here in Lexington, we're running a farm, and we're gardening and farming and bringing in food and running 2 cottage industries. And way down over in Paducah, and that side of the state, they just started their first ever social enterprise. So programs, I think what I'd like to share a whole lot about is just the evolution of how we're unique, but to the core, we are built on one solid foundation. In that. So we had the victim service standards. Then our state coalition took over the state contract, which I think is really important to understand, that we understand our money, how to use it, and are good stewards of the state's dollars that flow through our state coalition. And some of the fun, critical work, although I say fun only because it was more successful than we thought it would be, was our work and the work on the Commission on Women for Clemency and the clemency projects. And so after I left Oasis, I moved my way a little east and landed in Louisville and worked at the Center for Women and Families for about 9 years before leaving to come here to the Lexington area, and had the real honor and pleasure to work with the first group of women. I was working in prison doing support groups for women at Pee Wee Valley when the first group of ladies had commuted sentences from Brereton Jones. So if you fast forward, he commuted 10, and then Governor Fletcher pardoned all 10 of those ladies, by the way, and an additional lady, and commuted 6 more sentences. And then Governor Bashir, pardoned 10 more along the way. And then our last group of pardons were Bevan. He pardoned 9 and did 1 commutation. And that was such critical work that we were afraid. And Governor Jones took a huge risk. He took a huge risk to set people, give them a new opportunity. And I think his hesitation, he commuted instead of pardoning, because nobody knew how this was going to work. And I have to tell you that my experience in this work for the last 30 plus years is we didn't have templates. Nobody else was doing it. And Kentucky was truly leading the way, even with commutation. So it's been incredible. When I was at the center, I will say that each area kind of has the way that they can lead and do. But in Louisville, I had the opportunity to partner with Romania, and I got to go to Romania twice to start the first ever domestic violence programming in that country. That still, they have an office on women that looked just like Louisville's office on women. They wanted a shelter way back when, and I go, you're not ready for a shelter. You have no laws. It's kind of where we were in the late 70s. There were no laws or anything to really protect survivors, but you had to start somewhere. And that office today still exists thanks to Louisville's work in the Center for Women and Family. Kentucky was a first in a whole lot of areas, but for sure the mandate on police to be trained has had a critical long-term impact. And in my experience, where we were and the phone calls I made in the late 80s and early 90s for help for survivors versus what we get today is day and night. Our police forces, although imperfect, and you've got pockets everywhere here and there that still have some more work to do. But overall, that mandate from our legislature for judges and social workers and nurses and doctors, the creation of model policies and protocols for hospitals have just kind of thrust us forward in our ability to serve survivors, for survivors to hear from others and other professionals that they have value and they have worth, and there is help available, not just us out there alone spreading that message. It's really created a community response. And we created community responses too, community collaborations across the state for many years. In the 2000s, I think our legislative efforts slowed down a little bit. We had a lot of success in the 90s. And we got a little pushback here and there. I can remember one legislator going, "You women have gotten enough. Don't come back here for another few years." That's what we were told. And
Gotten enough.
you remember that?
Yeah.
You've gotten
Yeah,
enough. We've done enough for you little ladies. Leave us alone for a while. But so our focus became more of how do we serve? How do we reach? How do we reach survivors? How do we expand our programs? What do our communities need? And what does that look like? And so we started looking more in depth at our marginalized communities, women of color, immigrant women, LGBTQ, working with federal partners for protections along the way, being more inclusive of male survivors, even within our own facilities. A lot of work regarding economic justice and poverty, because we began to realize that domestic violence is not an act. That pattern of behavior that people are experiencing have touch points on so many other factors that affect people's ability to be able to leave, which is why Ann built so much housing, right? Which is why our state coalition really dipped into the very early models of IDA and match savings accounts for survivors to look at economic justice. And today, they're still seen as a national leader regarding all their housing services that we do. One fun fact, one thing I enjoyed more than anything was delivering 1,300 letters of support to Mitch McConnell's office back in the day in order to preserve VOCA funding, which is the Violence of Crime Act money that came through the doors. And we thought it was going to go away, but that was before there was emails, right? So we all carried stacks of paper and set them in his office here in Lexington. At the time, I was at the Louisville program. And with Mr. McConnell's support, that money was sustained and has grown and had a credible impact. The Manda's Law came along. Unfortunately, the Governor Nunn may have been an important component in getting things started, but unfortunately, Steve Nunn, his son, took the life of Amanda Ross, which I think became another transformative time in Kentucky, where we were all listening and paying attention on what we could do to improve services. And that's where there was some attention to better accountability and what that could really look like. Although I have to say that's not been fully implemented, but we're always open to continue to revisit how we continue to do services throughout the state. We got dating violence passed and leasing protections passed, all these things that impact survivors along the way. In 2004, I will tell you a little bit about, Ann wanted me to talk a little bit about GreenHouse17, but in 2004, Lexington's program was forced to close. That original why that was so critical in opening the first doors, unfortunately, was forced to close in 2004. And then a community group decided to hire a new executive director to start a program. And I put my hat in the ring, and lo and behold, I thought I'd be here about 6 or 7 years to get a program off the ground. And that was 22 years ago. So sometimes you just fit and you're right where you're supposed to be. But when I say evolution in all the different areas, I want to say all shelters have such amazing components and parts to them that they do. And but I'm particularly proud of GreenHouse17 with our farm and our industries that we provide. And we do visitation and exchange services, and now 3 counties, but serve all of the 17 counties in central Kentucky. You know, we reach around 7,000 survivors a year. They've either come through our shelter and our programs out here on the farm, because we're on a 40-acre horse farm. So we look really unique as far as our setting and what we're able to provide. On the other hand, I'm going to brag on the staff. This is not about GreenHouse17, but when you talk about going full circle with Mary Byron and her mother starting the Mary Byron Foundation, they used to give national awards to innovative programming, and GreenHouse17 received one of those awards and has been and was the only ever shelter to receive an award nationally. So that's because of the work of the coalition, people like Ann, who've helped forge the way, who have been tremendous role models. But my biggest kudos always will go to survivors, because they are our teachers. They are the ones that send up the warnings that we need to be paying attention to, of what works and what doesn't work, and listening to. And that's why who we are and what we've done and how we've evolved has happened. It's because of their courage and strength that gives us the courage and strength and the backbone to stand up for what they need. So thanks to everyone, including the Commission on Women.
Darlene, I'm going to kind of move us into another question with you from where you've kind of left off. And you've already expanded on it a little bit, but you know, what do you think the services today look like for survivors compared to even 30 years ago or 40 years ago?
Well, you know, when I first started this work, is what I can speak to most. We were a little more than what people would refer to as 3 hots and a cot. Just a little more than that. We did some support groups.
Yeah.
We had some community collaborations, but we didn't know what to do. You know, working with the center, I actually worked alongside for many years with the woman that opened the Center for Women and Families. She was the first advocate, and they forgot to buy food. Like, there was no real concept that, oh my gosh, we're going to have to feed people if they come.
Yeah.
And they talked about, and still to this day it's true, but they would talk about answering. They were terrified to answer the phone because they had no idea how to help. So it really was survivors that taught us along the way. How we've evolved since then, I mean, very holistic. I mean, from housing supports, um, safe exchanges, visitation, lots of support, counseling, therapeutic supports that are taking place. We no longer have lengths of stay. All of us are there and present for as long as a family needs. Most of us operate off of like no rules policies. We've evolved to understand the issues of substance use and how that impacts intimate partner violence. We've learned how to meet people where they are instead of those people having to meet us. And our rules, we needed to let that go. Most of us now are taking pets. We've reduced the barriers. I'm on a 40-acre horse farm. If I have to, I can take a horse. If that's what would help somebody leave a situation. So we've evolved because we've listened and paid attention. We are way different than we used to be.
I think some of the issues that have evolved also for us as an agency and as programs is understanding the complexities, especially that we face today. We've had the overturning of Roe versus Wade, which, unintended consequences, I think, for some of those people were, the lack of healthcare services that many of our women who have suffered rape, even marital rape, that, when a woman becomes pregnant, used to be the number one reason for death of a woman in the United States was childbirth.
Right.
So when we overturned, Roe versus Wade, we complicated all women's health care in such a way that, if she's having a instantaneous abortion that just happens on its own, which does happen all the time, we call them miscarriages. But when those kinds of things happen with women, that in itself puts us in a real bind to get that woman into services, because one of the major things we do is get women to, all the healthcare services that they're really in need of. And I think, the overturning of Roe versus Wade really put a big challenge on us to be able to help get women the kind of help that they need when they need it. I think also, how we have had to navigate substance abuse issues and the effects that they've had, because we've also compounded, what I would consider child abuse issues when women were considering abusing their child for staying with a batterer. Now they're also supposedly abusing their child by using substances. So that, in addition to mental health issues, has created such a complex service delivery system for us that continuity of care over, they didn't get in that shape overnight, and they're not going to come out of those issues overnight either. So from my perspective, that's how our continuum of care has helped kind of address some of those issues, but that's a hard nut to crack for services also.
And Ann, too, I would think we're much more inclusive in the sense of we recognize that domestic violence doesn't discriminate. And we've done a much better job community-wide welcoming and honoring LGBTQ communities, immigrant communities.
Yes.
And even wealthy communities who experience domestic violence too, where nobody thinks it really happens, but it does. So we've done a much better job educating the public and welcoming all survivors.
But DEI has also put us into a predicament for services now. So, that's a navigation issue that, that we have to deal with, because we've been working in those communities for decades now, and it's been a struggle. So right now it's even more of a struggle for us. So.
Well, one of the things I was most proud of when we started the shelter in Ashland was we had a linkage with the shelter and Pathways Mental Health Center.
Yes,
and in fact, they were the pass-through agency for our trust and agency money initially. Yes. And there was seamless and great continuity and connection with mental health services for the women, for the children, because we know that a child that grows up in an abusive home is much more likely to become an abuser. And with funding cuts and all kinds of developments, that linkage is not what it used to be. And I would hope, because at the time, Kentucky was a national leader in mental health services as well. And I think I'd like to see us get back to that, where we really provide seamless care for the substance abuse, mental health issues, and all of that, and provide the full range of services that the victims need.
The stigma that many of our women had even 40 years ago, a lot of times husbands and boyfriends, would call her crazy. Well, she's crazy. She made me do this, or she made me get angry, and all this kind of stuff. We women have experienced violence since the beginning of time. And really, when you think about where we've come today, in the last 100 years, we just got the boat 100 years ago. We couldn't even own property in our own name, until the late 60s, early 70s. So here we are, kind of in a way at full circle, in my opinion, getting ready to, think about how are we going to navigate, through these times right now when healthcare services for women and maybe even the vote is going to be, stymied for women if we aren't, alert and ready to, fight for those kind of things. So I think all of those issues play into all of our programs, because it is a big web of how these co-occurring issues roll into each other and do influence the way we provide services and the climate of what I would consider just taking care of human beings, just honestly, taking care of human beings for who they are, and, not questioning or blaming somebody for staying with an abuser. We always say there's a million reasons why women don't leave. And a whole lot of them are because of threats against themselves and their families and their dogs, their animals, all that kind of thing. Peggy, I'm going to go to you for just a second and ask you, from your perspective as someone who was from here when there was nothing for survivors to where we are today, where do you think we're going to go from here? Where do you think we need to go from here?
Oh, wow. So many dimensions. And I think as we are more sensitive to the substance abuse problem, the mental health challenges, I understand Darlene can answer this for me as to federal funding and whether that's what it used to be. It was so important in the early days, and particularly the Victims of Crime Act money, where we had training for police officers, because we learned that the most dangerous call a police officer makes is to go to a home where there's a domestic violence incident, and to give them training on de-escalating the situation, training for prosecutors in taking those reports seriously. When I first started talking to prosecutors, they'd say, honey, she just asked for it. And just raising those consciousness. And my fear is that money is not where it used to be. Maybe I hope Kentucky can fill in the blanks and continue to be a national leader in raising awareness and educating all the players in the system to be more aware of what needs to be done and helping them to do it. Training in our courts was instrumental in the early days, training judges to understand the complexity of the problem. And in fact, for a while, we always made a point of having a judge on our board, Ann, as you may remember, just to raise their consciousness. And we did. And so many things like that.
And the police.
Yes, it was crucial. We got a progressive police. David Welch hired a progressive police chief in 1978, Ron McBride, who was just night and day and willing to, he was on our board for many years, and he helped us get some of those federal grants for training for his officers, saying we need this, and so many things like that I'm hopeful that as I hope with programs like this and we raise some awareness that pressure can be put, including by our very powerful Kentucky Commission on Women members, that especially at the state level, to help us restore the prominence that Kentucky has traditionally had in mental health and in domestic violence services, so that we can be a shining light and provide that seamless service across the board.
So Darlene, I'm going to let you kind of take your take on somebody who's down in the trenches and who are providing those services. Where do you think we need to go from here?
Well, as proud as I have been to go through this journey this many years and seeing incredible work, and there's more work to be done. It's as simple as that, right?
Absolutely.
I think the area, funding, it always ebbs and flows, Peggy. I mean, it ebbs and flows federally, ebbs and flows a little bit on the state level. And we're always visiting and can use the support of the commission, always working with our legislators on how incredibly important and frontline our work is. During COVID, we were named and labeled as frontline workers. Like, we didn't get to close. We fought hard for hazard pay for our employees because they were coming to work every day, risking their own health and the health of their family kind of world. So we're always advocating in that area. But I think the biggest gap that we have not figured out, and that's not just Kentucky, but it nationally, is how to hold those that do harm accountable.
Yeah.
And the simple answer can't be jail, because we're not willing to jail people,
Right.
at least for a long enough time for somebody to be safe from their abuser. And I don't know that, shelters are a critically important part of safety and ongoing opportunity for many survivors. But it is not the sole answer anyway, either, because it's not changing batters' behaviors and it's not shifting the culture away. And we have as many women dying today at the hands of their abusers as we did 40 years ago. So we've not reduced the rate of murder of women in this country. We have drastically reduced the rate of murder of men, where women have had to protect themselves, basically, because they have other options through shelter programs and our expansive services. So batter accountability is where we're going to have to move. We have to rethink what it looks like. How do we keep victims safe without necessarily having to put somebody in jail for months and months or years at a time? And I believe there's ways to do it. I believe we could look at pilot programs of accountability, where very much similar to a drug and alcohol court, right? Where it's intensive, it's followed. You might be on some kind of monitoring system the entire time, while victims are aware. If you're within 3 miles of them, they would have access, and so they could get to safety in case somebody was trying to break that. We could utilize more of Amanda's law that was put into place that we've never utilized yet in the state, with monitoring that I think would help survivors and have accountability for batters. And then I also believe that abusers need to pay for their crimes, and that currently does not happen. And right now, if you looked at my world, GreenHouse17 provides all the food, the resources, all the belongings. When people show up here, they've got 2 trash bags left to their name.
Yeah.
Now we help a lot of non-residentials that never come to shelter, but those that come to shelter have lost everything. All the while, their partners are typically still sitting in their apartments or homes, watching their TVs, going to work or not, or whatever that work, and have all the cars while we're providing everything else. And there's almost no accountability. So without accountability, systemic and societally, I don't know how we shift this culture. So we've got to find a better way to continue to engage men as well in the solution.
And I think what I would add to that is one of my very first board members, board presidents, looked at me and said, "Ann, you do all this intervention work with families and victims. What are you doing to stop it from happening?" And I just said, that's a really good question, because we're so focused in on, attending to these traumatized victims and their entire family, that we pushed all our resources there, and we don't really, in my opinion, believe yet in our world that the funding of prevention is the only way that I can see that we're going to, change this culture of it's not okay to victimize. It's not okay to exert power and control. It's not okay, to withhold money and resources, from our most vulnerable people. So how do we change that culture? We came up with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and our culture basically says it's a no-no to drive drunk. We came up with, who would have thought Kentucky would throw out their number one cash crop, which is tobacco. We changed that culture, even though there's a whole lot of smokers still in our midst. But those are two kind of key things that I can think of on the prevention side or seatbelts. I mean, how many lives have we saved in, mandating seatbelts? So I think there's still a way for us to go on the prevention side on how we can change that culture. I don't know if we need to do it with maybe some better legislation down the road that we might need to think about. But I think that's still a big gap in our service delivery system in changing that culture. And it's still a place for us to go.
And in two areas, and I'm glad you brought that up, because the thing that came to mind, until we treat domestic violence like a human rights violation,
Yes,
and not a personal crime, we've got to elevate what this really is. It is a hatred of women and how women are treated, and believe that somehow I have a right to do this to you because you are less than me. So we have to elevate this crime to
and
a
how to
human
stop
rights.
that cycle of violence.
Yes. And we also, when we talk about leadership in the state, Green Dot, which is a nationally and internationally pretty renowned and researched program for prevention, was born in
Which started
Kentucky at the
here. Yeah.
University at Kentucky with Dr. Dorothy Edwards and,
Yes.
Christy Birch, who now runs a program
Yeah.
in Northern Kentucky, and individuals. Diane Fleet was a part of that, who's works here at GreenHouse17. That was born in the state of Kentucky. And we have 5 years of research that showed a reduction in high schools of 60% of violence towards girls during the time that people got Green Dot intervention. So we have some tools at our hand. We have some mechanisms. We have room for growth, but we have to embrace it, and we have to have the funding and be valued. Society's going to have to decide it needs to stop.
When we talk about Kentucky history in domestic violence, we also, another first for us was TK Logan's research on emergency protective orders. So I was in Washington, D.C. at our national conference at the time, and they had this big rollout publicity, and nobody in the room, including Kentucky's coalition, knew that it was even going to be announced on a national level that Kentucky had just completed and delivered research on the availability and the proof that emergency protective orders saved lives, actually work. So Kentucky, as horrible as a lot of our statistics are, and there are some horrible ones, we have made significant impact on the United States and on our state. But, the bottom line is we've got a lot of work to do still, a whole lot of work to do. So I'm going to kind of breach this question to the two of you to help us start wrapping up. It is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And personally, I think, we need to work on this all year long. So what can anyone who might be watching today do at a personal or local level to support survivors? Peggy, do you have any thoughts on how you think we can?
Well, first and foremost, I think education is key to find out what's going on in your local shelter there throughout Kentucky. What and this goes back to our early days when we got civic clubs to come help us put together shelters and furnish rooms. What can the local community do to be supportive of our individual shelters? And what can we do as a state? That I see a role for the Kentucky Commission on Women to play in identifying priorities, and just as they did for us back in the early days, help us lobby as far as the legislation that we need to get things done.
Okay. Darlene, what are your thoughts on what the average person can do at this point?
Oh, be knowledgeable, do your homework, reach out, believe survivors, get involved, be a voice. I think sometimes the best thing we can do is lead by being role models in how we engage our community, our family in these discussions, and elevate the value of survivors and what they bring. Survivors should be seen as much more than what's happened to them. They are a whole person. And they should be defined as the human being they are and respected for that. And if we could do that as a community, and of course you can support your programs, get engaged, you can always volunteer, come around, take tours, know what's going on, educate your community. And financial support is always welcome to all of our organizations across the state. Yeah.
I tell people all the time, there is not an agency or a coalition in this state and probably in this country that does the kind of services that these are programs. All 15 of us, there is nobody that can even come close to the services we provide, because we're basically taking complete families, individuals to children, whatever, and we are wrapping our arms around them in a complete way, physically, emotionally, financially, medically. There is nobody in Kentucky that provides the services that we do. And so we've got to, I think, tell our story better and let people know who we are and where we are, because the people who need us the most are all out there, and they're usually the hardest to serve because of all these issues. I just want to say thanks to my good friends for showing up today, and I'm going to get ready here and turn it back over to our fearless leader, Heather, and we can start wrapping up, I think.
Thank you, Ann. And thank you, Peggy and Darlene. What an incredible conversation about an important topic. We appreciate your expertise and your time today, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us and those who are watching us today. My biggest takeaway from today's conversation is that Kentucky has really led the way on creating and providing services to providers, and that the Kentucky Commission on Women's History is deeply intertwined with that work and the history of this movement. Yeah. But we haven't necessarily moved the needle on reducing the occurrence of domestic violence against women, so that means we have a lot more work to do. I look forward to continuing the partnership between those who are doing this important work and the commission. So stay tuned on what we do next there. Before we close out, I just want to take this opportunity to again thank our host, Ann, and our guests, Peggy and Darlene, and all of our commissioners who joined us in the background that the live stream doesn't show. We appreciate your all being here today and making this a priority. We will be archiving this recording of this conversation on our YouTube channel for future viewing and reference, so anyone can watch it anytime. Feel free to share it with people as well. And our next conversations with commissioners is scheduled for December. Our topic and guests will be announced soon, and the best way to find out who that will be and what that will be is to keep up with us on our social media platforms. You can sign up through our contact us page at our website, women.ky.gov. You can follow us on Instagram or Facebook, and you can subscribe to this YouTube channel to be notified of when we'll be live streaming next. So thank you again to our hosts and our guests.